Billy Carson famously states that the Bible copied stories from the ancient Sumerians. I'd like to hone in on the Torah genealogies of the patriarchs and the Sumerian King's List. So he publicly argues that the Bible, including the Torah, copied or adapted stories from much earlier Sumerian sources, and he frequently points to the Sumerian King's List, or SKL, as evidence. That framing, however, goes well beyond what mainstream Assyriology or biblical scholarship supports, especially when we narrow the scope specifically to genealogies of the patriarchs. Let's do this carefully and surgically, focusing only on the Torah genealogies, Genesis 5, 10, and 11, the Sumerian King's List, what overlaps exist, what does not overlap, and whether copying is the right model. So, what Billy Carson claims in brief, fairly stated, Carson's core assertions are usually Sumerian texts, predate the Torah by millennia. The Bible reuses long lifespans, flood narratives, early rulers, and genealogies. Therefore, the Torah is a derivative work, not original revelation. The Sumerian King's List is central to this argument because it contains antediluvian figures, extremely long reigns, a flood divided history. So the comparison sounds compelling at a surface level. What the Sumerian King List actually is, genre matters here. The SKL is a royal legitimation document designed to show divine kingship continuity, a political religious text, not a family genealogy. Key features lists kings, not families. Authority flows from top down from the gods. Reigns measured in sar, ner, and sos, sexagesimal units. Pre-flood reigns are symbolic mythic in scale. Example, pre-flood. Alulim of Eridu, reign 28,800 years. Alalngar, 36,000 years. Those are not human lifespans in any biological sense. What the Torah genealogies are and are not. Genesis genealogies are familial lineages, not royal lists. They're focused on descent, not political legitimacy. They're anchored in named fathers and sons, measured in years lived, not reigns ruled. Critically, Adam, Seth, Noah, Shem, etc. are not kings. Authority flows bottom up through covenant, not divine kingship. God is not handing kingship to men. This alone places the texts in different literary universes. So the direct comparison, SKL versus Torah. You have feature, the Sumerian King's List, and the Torah genealogies. So the feature, purpose, legitimize kingship for SKL, and the Torah was to preserve covenant lineages. The subjects in the SKL were the kings, and in the Torah genealogies were fathers and sons. Authority in the SKL were gods and kings. In the Torah, God and family covenant. Time units, sar, ner, and sos. In the Torah, years. Flood roll in the SKL was a break in kingship, and in the Torah, a moral reset of humanity. Post-flood, in SKL, the kings resume, and in the Torah, nations disperse. No Sumerian kings appears in Genesis by name. No patriarch appears in the SKL. This is a critical point often glossed over. The flood is the only structural overlap, and it's not unique. So yes, both traditions include a flood. Both divide history into pre- and post-flood eras, but flood traditions exist across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond. The Genesis flood theology is fundamentally different. Moral judgment, ethical causation, covenant aftermath, Genesis 9. In the SKL, the flood is almost incidental. Then the flood swept over the land. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven. No repentance, no covenant, no ethics. Why copying is the wrong model. Mainstream scholars, including believing and non-believing ones, overwhelmingly argue Genesis is not copying Sumerian material, it is responding to it. This is often called theological polemic. Examples: Mesopotamia, many gods, divine kings. Genesis, one God, no divine kingship. Mesopotamia, humans serve gods as labor. Genesis, humans bear God's image. Genesis consistently strips away polytheism, mythic exaggeration, political propaganda. If it were copying, it's an odd kind of copying that removes the gods, removes divine kings, removes temples as cosmic centers, and removes mythic cosmology. What serious scholarship actually says. Even critical scholars, Jacobson, Lambert, Walton, agree. The SKL and Genesis share cultural air, not textual dependence. The genealogies do not map onto one another. No evidence exists of Hebrew scribes translating SKL names, structural borrowing of kingship lists into Genesis. Billy Carson's claim is therefore rhetorical, not evidentiary. So the bottom line, focused, clean conclusion, Billy Carson is correct that Sumerian texts are older. He is incorrect that Torah genealogies are copied from the SKL. The two texts serve different purposes, use different categories of people, express opposite theologies, and Genesis reads less like plagiarism and more like a deliberate counter-narrative. So here's what Billy Carson actually states, distilled carefully from his books, lectures, podcasts, and public interviews, without caricature, but also without granting more than he explicitly claims, as I want to be fair. So I'll separate this into explicit claims, implied claims, and what he does not actually demonstrate. Billy Carson's explicit statements, his own position, across compendium of the Emerald Tablets, won't doesn't mean broke, and repeated podcast appearances, Carson consistently inserts the following. The Bible is derived from earlier Sumerian texts. He states that Sumerian tablets are thousands of years older than the Torah. Hebrew scribes borrowed, adapted, or reworked Sumerian myths. Biblical narratives are therefore not original revelation. He often phrases this as the Bible is a rewrite of much older Sumerian stories. Genesis genealogies correspond to the Sumerian King List. Carson explicitly claims the long lifespans of biblical patriarchs are the same phenomenon as the long reigns of Sumerian kings. Both traditions describe pre-flood superhuman figures. The Bible humanized what were originally Anunnaki god kings. In simplified form, his claim is patriarchs equals downgraded Sumerian kings. The flood marks the same historical break in both traditions. He states the Genesis flood is the same event as the SKL flood. Post-flood figures are genetically diminished. Lifespans shorten because divine DNA is reduced. This is where he connects genetics, Anunnaki, Nephilim, and patriarchal longevity. Moses, or later editors, had access to Mesopotamian libraries. Carson frequently asserts Hebrew elites lived in Babylonian captivity. They had access to tablets. They selectively rewrote the material to fit monotheism, and this is framed as they removed the other gods and kept Yahweh. What Carson strongly implies, but does not prove, patriarchs were originally non-human or semi-divine. He strongly implies that Adam, Noah, etc. were genetically altered beings. Longevity is biological, not symbolic. Humans today are a downgraded species. This is not stated explicitly in every talk, but it is a consistent through line. Biblical theology is a political rewrite. He implies that monotheism was a control mechanism, and Yahweh was one of many gods, and the Torah was written to consolidate authority. Again, implied, but not textually demonstrated. What Carson does not actually do. This is the critical scholarly gap. He does not provide textual parallels between SKL names and patriarchs. He does not show Hebrew transliterations of Sumerian king names. He does not demonstrate scribal dependence line by line. He does not distinguish between reign length and lifespan. He does not address genre differences, royal list versus family genealogy. He does not cite Assyriologists supporting direct genealogical copying. Instead, his method is chronological priority, assumed dependence, superficial similarity, asserted equivalence. His claim, reduced to its core logic, Carson's argument stripped down, is essentially Sumerians are older, they wrote about long-lived rulers. Genesis has long-lived people, therefore Genesis copied Sumeria. That is correlation, not demonstrated derivation. Why this matters for the patriarchal genealogies. Carson's position collapses precisely at the point we're focusing on. No patriarch is a king. No king is a father-son covenant figure. No SKL genealogy exists. No dynastic descent matches Genesis. This is why serious scholars do not equate the two lists. So a fair, accurate summary sentence, if you needed one sentence that captures the stance accurately, Billy Carson claims that the Torah genealogies are a later humanized retelling of Sumerian god-king traditions, especially the Sumerian King List, stripped of polytheism and rewritten as a monotheistic history, but he does not demonstrate direct textual dependence. That is the most precise formulation possible. So let's actually settle it with a clean, testable standard. The claim that we're debunking. Billy Carson's core claim, as he regularly frames it, is that Genesis is copied from older Mesopotamian sources, and when we narrow down to your target, the insinuation becomes the Torah's early patriarchal genealogies are basically a rewrite of the Sumerian King's List. To debunk once and for all, we need just a fair rule. What would count as copying? To credibly claim textual dependence or copying, you need at least one of these. Name correspondence, same names or traceable transliterations. Phrase line correspondence, shared wording, repeated formulas. Structural correspondence that is specific, not generic, same genre, same mechanics. Transmission pathway that explains how a Hebrew text is copying that specific Sumerian text language plus access plus time. If none of these land, copied is just a vibe. So, names. The simplest slam dunk, and it fails. There is no overlap of names between the patriarchs in Genesis 5 and 11, Adam through Noah, Shem through Terah, and the antediluvian kings of the SKL, Alulim, Alongar, Enmenluana, Damuzid, etc. Even the SKL itself, in its standard transliteration tradition, presents totally different names and a different list type. If Genesis copied the SKL, we would expect some recognizable name mapping. There isn't any. Wording. Word-for-word talk collapses under scrutiny. Carson is on record making almost word-for-word copied style claims about Genesis borrowing in his debate orbit, and the pushback from people who have read the texts is there aren't verbatim parallels beyond generic motifs. But even if we ignore creation myth debates and focus only on genealogies, Genesis genealogies use a famula formula. X lived, begat, lived after, total years. The SKL uses a kingship formula. Kingship descended from heaven. City X, King Y. He ruled in years. City fell. Kingship moved. Those are not the same lines, not the same repeated phrases, not the same literary machinery. Genre. SKL is not a genealogy, and scholars say so. This is the once and for all point most people miss. The Sumerian King List is a royal legitimation list. Museums and scholarship describe it as a succession of cities and their rulers with reign lengths, a political theological document. Genesis 5:11 are lineage genealogies, family descent, not royal propaganda. Even summaries of the scholarly comparison note a key asymmetry. The SKL lacks regular genealogical notices. It's not built like a father-son lineage document the way Genesis 5 is. So when someone says patriarch list equals king's list, they're equating two different kinds of text. The flood divider is a generic similarity, not evidence of copying. Yes, both have a pre-flood and a post-flood section. In the ETCSL translation of the SKL, it explicitly totals the pre-flood kings and ends with, then the flood swept over. But that's not enough to prove copying. Why? Because the rest of the architecture differs. SKL. Flood is a pivot in kingship continuity. Kingship descended from heaven. Genesis. Flood is a pivot in moral covenantal history. Humanity judged covenant with Noah. A flood motif shared across cultures does not equal a copied genealogy. Numbers. Reign years versus lifespan years are not the same claim. Carson's move is usually SKL has huge numbers, Genesis has huge numbers, therefore same tradition, same beings, same copied source. But the SKL's numbers are explicitly reign lengths, how long someone ruled, not how long someone lived. That difference matters because it changes what the numbers even mean. Also, the SKL itself behaves like a literary theological charter text that gets redacted and shaped over time for political meaning, a major theme in scholarship on the SKL. So treating SKL numbers as raw biographical data is already a category error. So the verdict. The Torah genealogies of the patriarchs are not copied down from the Sumerian King List by any defensible academic standard because no name correspondences, no phrase line correspondences, different genre and purpose. The one big overlap, a flood divider, is generic. Numbers refer to different things, reigns versus lifespans. What is fair to say is Genesis was composed in an ancient Near Eastern world where Mesopotamian traditions existed, but influence or shared culture on the environment is not the same as copied, and SKL to Genesis genealogy copying specifically doesn't land. Side by side, Torah patriarchal genealogies versus Sumerian Kings List. We'll compare Genesis 5 and 11 directly against the antediluvian portion of the Sumerian King List. Genesis 5, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Sumerian Kings List, after kingship descended from heaven. Immediate difference. Genesis opens with human lineage. SKL opens with divine political authority. This already places them in different literary categories. Subject type. Genesis, Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. SKL, Alalim, Alalngar, Enmenluana, Enmengalana, Demuzid, Ensipadzidana. Critical point. Genesis figures are fathers. SKL figures are kings. There is no crossover of names, titles, or roles. If Genesis were copying the SKL, this is where we'd expect overlap. There is none. Structure of each entry. Genesis, repeated formula. X lived A years and begot Y. X lived after he begot Y B years and had other sons and daughters. Total C years. SKL, repeated formula. City X, King Y. He ruled in years. City fell. Kingship moved to City Z. These are not parallel structures. Genesis tracks a biological descent. SKL tracks a political succession. Genesis preserves family continuity. SKL preserves city-state legitimacy. What the numbers mean. Genesis numbers, age at fatherhood. SKL numbers, length of reign. Genesis numbers, total lifespan. SKL numbers, political duration. Genesis numbers, biological metric. SKL numbers, theological political metric. Example, Methuselah lives 969 years. Elohim rules 28,800 years. These are not even measuring the same thing. Calling this the same tradition is a category error. Father-son relationships. Genesis, explicit father-son chains. X begot Y, genealogical continuity. SKL, rare or absent. King Y ruled, city-based discontinuity. Genesis is obsessed with lineage, and the SKL is obsessed with kingship transfer between cities. That alone destroys the copied genealogy claim. Role of gods. Genesis, one God. God creates humans. God does not rule as king. SKL, many gods. Gods grant kingship. Gods appoint kings. Genesis removes divine kingship entirely. The SKL centers it. This is not copying, it's theological inversion. The flood divider, the only similarity. Genesis, moral judgment, human corruption, covenant afterward. SKL, narrative reset, political transition, kingship resumes. SKL line, then the flood swept over the land. Genesis, and God said, I will destroy man whom I have created. Same event motif, but completely different meaning. A shared flood does not equal copied genealogies. Post-flood continuation. Genesis 11. Shem, Arpachshad, Terah. Lifespans shorten gradually. Focus narrows to Abraham. SKL post-flood. New dynasties, reign lengths collapse suddenly. Focus widens to cities. Genesis funnels toward one family. SKL expands toward its imperial ideology. So the test for copying. To sustain Carson's claim, we would need at least one of the following. Shared names, shared formulas, same genre, same purpose, same numerical meaning, same authority structure. None exist. Final verdict, unavoidable. The Torah patriarchal genealogies are not copied from the Sumerian King List. What actually happened is far more interesting. Genesis operates in the same ancient Near Eastern world. It deliberately rejects divine kingship. It replaces mythic rulers with human fathers. It turns political mythology into covenant history. That is not plagiarism. That is theological confrontation. Thank you very much. It's been fun. Until next time.